What does it take for us to build workplaces and a world that is fit for the future? A question that plagues many a leader and many an organization. How do we learn from our experiences? Are we shaping ourselves and our workplaces to be fit for the future? What does it take to invest in people and nurture success? How do we ensure that our investments in diversity, equity, and inclusion are delivering to the intended goals? Are we seeing the very invisible responsibility that most employees carry, that of being caregivers? What does it take to build a caregiver friendly workplace? Are leaders caregivers? What can leaders and organizations learn from caregivers and their experiences? How do we create safe spaces that enable inclusion? Is this something that is holding, especially women, back from the C suite? We are delighted to bring to you a series of conversations around the idea of building future fit corporates. It is my absolute pleasure today to have this conversation with Sudeep Ralhan. Sudeep is an HR leader and a consultant, a coach these days, having worked in a variety of organizations. He leverages his 20 years of experience as an HR leader in the tech, BPO, FMCG, and startup spaces to create business impact, develop leaders, build culture, and drive change across industries and geographies. He partners with organizations and leaders who share this vision of transforming the world of work through inclusion, innovation, and well being. He's passionate about learning, growing, and making a difference in the lives of others. On the personal front, he enjoys reading, watching horror movies, and exploring new places to eat. Welcome, Sudeep. It is lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Bhavna. Pleasure to be here as well, and thanks for the kind introduction.
Sudeep, what would you like for us to know more about you beyond what I have introduced you?
Well, first of all, if you are a lover of horror movies, then give me a shout out. I'm always looking to, expand my community of people who enjoy that. But also, I think one of the things is that over my career, I've also grown increasingly passionate on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And
Mm.
by virtue of extension, well-being as well. And I've personally grown up with very strong women role models in my life.
Mm.
I'm an extremely passionate and involved uncle of my nephew and niece, and therefore I think all of these own personal perspectives also increase my commitment and thoughtfulness on the subject of DEI and well-being. So it's always a pleasure to connect with like-minded professionals like yours who are doing so much great work.
So, we are talking about organizations, employee well being, diversity at the workplace, and caregivers. What about this interests you?
What interests me in this entire space is how this agenda has evolved over a period of time. I mean, with the benefit of the 23 years of experience that I have, when I look back and think about where it was when I started, we used to talk about just basic insurance. That was a good thing, right? And
Yes.
then the IT industry came, and then it evolved to saying, let's think about physical workspaces. People started
Mhm.
paying attention to benefits like giving transport and cabs and good offices, which is
Yes.
actually a new thing for India at that time, right?
Right.
In-house, really cool cafeterias and stuff like that.
That's
So I
right.
think it transitioned to something around that space. Over a period of time, as diversity became front and center of the conversation, people started spending a little bit more time thinking about what does this mean for women and how do we make sure that there is more representation of women, and then by extension other communities who've not really been in the mainstream as well, right? So that's the third, I would say, the step of conversation. And then the fourth one, which is what I feel we are seeing now, and I think
Mm,
it's been definitely accelerated due to the COVID pandemic,
mm,
is the connectedness between inclusion and well-being, and how well-being is now a part of the DEI conversation. Because if you're always talking about bring your whole self to work, then your whole self has to include the caregiving element, which most of us are in some way or the other. So and therefore, I mean, the connectedness to all of this is obviously to creating more engaged workforces, high performance workforces, and business performance, right? So that linkage and this evolution is really something that interests me.
that's interesting. And I would, love to double click on so many things that you said. Let's start at the beginning. So, at some point, let's say organizations or heads of organizations bought into the idea that it's a good thing to have diversity, right? And if you remember, there used to be many things that were done, at least I remember that, about making the business case for diversity. And what I remember in that is that one of the things one would talk about is how um, people thinking differently is a good thing for leadership teams to have. Yeah. And how can you get that diversity of thought is let's have representation of people that come from different walks of life. The first very obvious idea of diversity is gender, and let's just take that thread for now. And we said let's bring in more women, but we have observed over the last 10 odd years that a lot of effort has been done to increase the supply or the pipeline, and yet it feels like it is a leaky pipeline to the C suite. What do you think is going on?
I mean, there are so many things going on that it's difficult to summarize. But I think there are a few factors at play here. The first is, while everyone agrees that diversity is good, and diversity, like you said, brings innovation, and innovation leads to better performance, and there are enough business cases that establish that now. And people agree that gender diversity is an important component of that. That understanding is not necessarily as consistent, right? For example, a CEO might believe this, a CHRO might believe this, but does everyone at the CEO minus one level believe it intrinsically? Because unless you believe in it, you're not going to be able to execute the agenda so deeply, right? And then you execute at the surface, right? We continue to have cases where women are called diversity candidates, and this word hurts me so much. Like, I cringe every time I see it uh, hear it in a call, see it on LinkedIn, see it in a WhatsApp group. Just the tagging of women as diversity candidates tells us what's going wrong with the agenda.
Yeah,
Just the fact, I mean, if you overhear some of the ground reality conversations between, say, recruiters and hiring managers,
yeah,
right? It would shock you to the core, saying, this is not what your CEO is trying to say. This is not what your CHR, and it's not their fault.
yeah,
People are doing what they can because they've just been given a mandate and they're trying to drive it, right? Because their salaries and their bonuses depend upon it.
yeah,
But I think the ability to translate the higher level agenda into a deeper and a more consistent understanding of it and what it means at a ground level, and also listening, right? I mean, sometimes shoving down an agenda is not necessarily the best thing. It's better to go slow and make sure that there is deeper understanding of the agenda on the line. And a lot of people are not willing to do that. They are in a hurry. CEOs are in a hurry. CHR is in a hurry. There are metrics to be met. There are commitments that have been made. So I think it's a combination of these three or four things, which means that the diversity agenda and the initiatives to increase representation of women are not always either being implemented with the right spirit or not being implemented consistently. And that sooner or later shows up. So when that shows up is when you start seeing the leakage in the bucket, right?
Mhm.
Where you start seeing there being gaps in senior level promotions, in
Mhm.
attitudes, in talent reviews, in hiring, and so on. And then the second are, of course, more external factors. I mean, the fact is, it's not just corporate world and senior leadership, but if you look at COVID and what it's done, right? There is so much now research that tells us that the pandemic actually reversed a lot of the progress we had made
It's true.
on girls' education, on women's education, higher education, and on women's representation in the workforce, not just in India, but pretty much across the world.
Yeah.
So there are external factors at play, and I think there are some of these internal factors at play in not being able to drive the agenda thoughtfully and consistently.
So, one of the hypotheses that we posit is that a large number of women may not have the capabilities, skills, or agency to grow in an organization. But on many an occasion, they may have the skills, they may have the ambition. I think one of our guests, Rashmi Mandloy, quoted a research that established that women have very high ambition. Actually, significantly higher, especially in countries like India, and you'd be surprised. But the point is that it is not about them having the capabilities or ambition or drive to want to grow, but there are some other factors, right? And our positing is that we know about the research that mobility, motherhood, and marriage are the three big reasons that hold women back.
Right.
And the underlying factor in all of this is the stereotype that women are better caregivers, that caregiving responsibility is disproportionately shouldered by women in households, whether it is married women or even single women. Somehow, caregiving seems to lean in on women, or women take it up more. What have been your observations? Can you give us some instances from your career where you may have observed this?
No, absolutely, and I think it works both ways. Whenever Women's Day comes along, I am always telling my team that let's not talk only to the women and about the women. Let's talk about, let's talk to everyone and let's talk about
Yeah,
inclusion because
yeah,
Women's Day is actually not about women; it's about inclusion in my mind, at least, right? And
right.
until you make, like you said, a difference to the entire ecosystem, you're not going to be able to make a difference to one part. So I'll give you an example. This was about 10, 12 years ago, and
Mhm.
there was a leader in I won't name the organization. I worked with multiple orgs. I don't want to name the
Yeah.
org, but one of the leaders I used to work with, he would get up and at 4:30 and often say that, I have to, this meeting has to end at this time or it's scheduled certain time because I have to go and pick up my son or whatever daughter from the school at this time and take them home or take them to daycare, etc. And he was fairly senior, so they wouldn't do it to his face, but people would snigger, right? People would
Mm.
snigger and talk about it, saying, "Ye kya hai?" Because it was okay for a woman to do it, to say,
Oh,
I have to go and take care of, people at home, I have to do this, I have to do that. But for a guy to do things like this was 10, 11 years ago. Of course, now people may even think it even now, but they can't say it for being politically incorrect. But my point is, until you change that mindset, you think that it is women who are supposed to be the caregivers. The moment men assume that role, it's difficult. I mean, I have, for example, got reactions like, "Oh, that is such a brave thing for a man to do." When I took a break last year and I took 3 or 4 months off work, and I got caught, and I was so surprised. I was laughing, but it truly it's okay for women to take a break to take care of family or take care of health and take care of other things, but it's not okay for men to do so. So I don't think it's brave at all. I mean, it's just a logical thing to do. But I just find it ex- I think until we take away, and this is not the responsibility, I would say, while I'm sure organizations and corporates have a role to play, but I think this is a societal evolution that needs to take place constantly. And I think only if we are able to do that will we be able to address the core point of what you're talking about, which is that women being saddled with the always the responsibility of being a caregiver, which means that they are prevented sometimes from actually achieving a lot of the other ambitions that women may have.
If you were close by, we would have done a high five. And I'm so glad that, you brought up this whole thing about the stereotype of the provider man and, the role that men have to play. I was reminded of one such man. Now, so if if the head of the organization does this, people can snigger at the back, right? But here was one colleague of mine who said, I have to take care of my children or something. And the person, the leader in charge in that meeting, I remember, said, "Why you don't have your wife?"
Yeah, exactly. Oh God.
And I was like, "Oh, what if the wife is working? What if the wife is traveling? Or yes, what if you don't have a wife? Or what if you're taking on this responsibility?" But I mean, those were the times, and I'm so glad that at least it's now politically incorrect. You might, but it is still far from it being normalized. So
Yeah.
I do see your point. And personally, in my home, I know that my husband would go for, parent-teacher meetings and or mother meetings and feel very left out because he was the only guy, which
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
another interesting challenge. Um, Thank you for sharing that anecdote. I think it is very valuable. Can you also share with us some instances of when you think some women colleagues of yours may have approached a situation differently or found it difficult to talk about their caregiver role at the workplace?
See, I don't. It would be, I think, presumptuous of me to immediately quote uh, colleagues or women, but I have seen instances where I feel women have been apologetic,
Hmm.
right? And I think I've actually said that to quite a few people. So, as my in my previous role as in my HR head as in Upstocks or at Walmart, or even in GSK, which was a relatively more conservative FMCG organization, but very evolved by its standards,
Hmm.
I would have had to say this to women to say, don't be apologetic about it. I
Right.
mean, ultimately, we have to measure everyone by the same standards, which is your performance against goals and
Hmm.
the behavioral competencies that you demonstrate. I mean,
That's right.
ultimately, those are the only two standards that matter. No other standards matter. So I think women being apologetic about taking time off, of needing flexibility, of personal health issues. I mean, the embarrassment that women have to suffer, I've seen sometimes when they talk about personal health, is very it's not nice to see, right? And I keep have to telling women, keep having to say this to women, to say to not just be apologetic about it. And I think the reason they're apologetic about it is obviously because the environment is such that they have to feel apologetic about it, right? And so on. And I think the way the the way the future of work is, and especially got accelerated during pandemic, is that we have moved towards, whether some leaders like to believe it or not, but we've moved towards complete work life integration, right, in many
Hmm.
ways. And I personally believe that work life balance is an outdated concept because it's all about integration. So if you are integrated constantly and one part of your life spills into the other, then it is absolutely okay to give your whole to quote unquote whatever it is that you call life, could be your children, could be your family, could be your hobbies and interests, and give your whole to work as well. It's possible to do both. And I think women find it difficult to do that because of the expectations that the world around them has. If you're returning from a career break, it is okay to say that I will take time to transition back into work and so on. But it is not okay to settle for a salary lesser than what you were getting when you left for work. I'm not saying you should be unrealistic and say I want 100% hike or whatever, but you should at least get what you were getting 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago when you left the workplace, right? Why would you be so apologetic and settle for a lower level and a lower salary than what you were getting some time ago? So I think that level of apologetic behavior is what we need to be mindful of. But I think that's where the other challenge comes in, which is how do you spot it? I mean, you're running in an organization of 10 to 100, 200, 300, 400 people. Leaders can still play a role. But in organizations with tens of thousands and lakhs of people, you have to create those mindsets at the middle layer amongst managers who are still overwhelmingly male, and actually even women. I mean, women are as much a victim of patriarchy as men are, right? So how do you create I think that's as I'm saying it, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by what I'm saying, but I feel that that's really the biggest challenge on how to create and change the mindsets amongst people managers. So they spot these problems, they spot the inequities, they spot these apologetic behavior and weed it out. Because going back to the original point, an apologetic person is not a person who's bringing their whole self to work. And if you're not bringing your whole self to work, you will not be able to perform at your best, which means that ultimately a team and an organization is impacted. So I'm not doing it for altruistic reasons. I might be personally passionate about D&I, but I'm not doing it for altruistic reasons. I'm doing it because I believe the organization benefits by having everyone bring their whole self to work, including women. So these are the speed bumps that we have to erase along the way. I know I sort of deviated a little bit from what you originally asked, but that's my train of thought on this topic.
So I could see myself in so many parts of what you said. Okay. And I'm tempted to bring my own example for the sake of our conversation, which is that I wish someone told me, don't be apologetic. So I would have loved to have a manager like you, preferably a woman. We didn't have too many women managers, but preferably a woman who I could aspire to grow to be, who I would see and who would tell me that, this is possible. But even if not, I had some lovely managers who I absolutely loved till date, who guided me and also managed me very well. But it would have been nice if they said it point, don't be apologetic. I would have gained in my career significantly. That is one part. The second part is that I'm fairly unemployable in the corporate world today, is how I believe, having done everything that I have done so far. Um, my candidature or my resume will be seen in a certain lens today. And I've had search consultants, my friends, my well wishers, tell me, don't think about going back. And if you do think about going back, don't have high expectations of what you can earn. Okay. So, my deviation of my career. So, people will judge my resume by, you've been out of corporate world, right? Although I'm building this organization, although I'm charting fairly uncharted terrain, right? But the frontline person who shortlists my resume, whether it is the recruitment consultant who pitches my candidature, or it is the, even the keyword parser, will not look at my candidature for the wholesomeness of my experience. right? And I will not have the opportunity to have a negotiation to say, actually, in doing what I'm doing, whether it is, being a mother or being a caregiver or being a social entrepreneur, here are the skills that I have built, which could be really valuable for an organization. Now, you are an HR person. What do you think you would tell other CHROs on the back of this exchange that we've had? How do you tap into the talent that our conventional systems may not be able to?
I think that's a fantastic point. It's honestly a struggle that I don't think it's a CHRO problem.
Yes,
Um, I think it's more a business issue because I don't have to convince other CHROs. I think every CHRO is convinced of what you're saying. It's the business, and not for any other reason. There are two, three factors at play in a slightly longish response again. I think the factor at play really is about supply and demand.
okay,
And when the talent supply is more than the demand, which is unfortunately the case in most cases, unless you're looking at very hot skills, quote unquote, then the tendency to restrict yourself to templatized job descriptions and requirements becomes higher. And
that's right.
getting a business to say, look beyond. I mean, I see so many CHROs fighting the same battle, saying, stop thinking of years of experience, quote unquote. Stop thinking of that, right? Or stop thinking. I mean, I used to go back to Walmart and say, a Doug McMillan wouldn't be the CEO of the world's largest company if we had applied this areas of a typical corporate ladder with years of experience. He probably need to be 120 years old before he becomes the CEO of a Walmart, right? So
Absolutely.
you can't apply those things, right? And in today's day and age, there are 19, 20-year-olds who are creating billion-dollar companies right around us. Right? So you can't do that. But I think this is going to be a bit of a challenge. It's going to take a little bit of a time to change. And I think that's why I would argue that it's not just women, but I think men too who suffer from the same issue, that anyone who deviates from a standard template of a corporate career tends to find it really difficult to get a re-entry in a more sensible way,
That's right.
because hiring managers, leaders do tend to look at a fairly standardized way of thinking. But having said that, I think one way around it is truly the gig economy. So,
Mm,
we haven't really embraced that very well. And the word gig economy, unfortunately, has connotations because of all the recent issues with, say, moonlighting, or with, our connotation is with Uber and Ola and drivers and Swiggy and Zomato, right? That's how we think about gig economy, at least in India. But if you look at the West, they have, US, for example, has embraced gig economy in a much bigger way in technology and in other functions. And I think we have to do the same. And that really, I feel, is the answer to both of the issues that we've been discussing. The one that you brought up right now, which is about people and women on a career break, or not on a career break, but having taken deviations, like you said, from a standard career path, done something different, wanting to do a more regular corporate work again. And and people who are just untapped potential, right? Women who are at home, veterans, people who are retired, want to continue to be engaged in meaningful work. Uh, there are just so much untapped talent potential out there, which, with the use of technology and a change in mindset and regulations, because that's the other challenge in India. The gig economy yet is not governed by thoughtful regulation and labor
that's,
regulation. And that makes everyone a little bit worried about
yeah,
stepping into that space. So it will require a combination of the right labor regulations, a bit of change in mindset, and then the right policies. But I really do believe that leveraging a gig model and using technology more intelligently will might actually start solving some of these problems and accelerate the change.
right. In my experience, Sudeep, I'm going to take a little different track right now. In my experience, I have found that it is difficult for both men and women who have caregiving responsibilities. And by caregiving responsibilities, I'm right now taking the whole universe, right? Sometimes parenting, sometimes caring for a sibling who might have a certain challenge, sometimes older adults, sometimes, we are in a society where I could be responsible for my aunt or uncle because my cousin is not in town, or because they don't have children, or so many other factors. And the caregiving universe is fairly wide. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to your earlier point about being apologetic, I might feel, whether a man or woman, that this topic does not have space in a professional setting. It's not something you talk about at work. So, for example, to the leader who went out to say, I have to go pick up my children, if that person said, I have a meeting and left, it might have just passed and may have just been a little easier. And but if the person said that I'm going to pick up my children, you would have said, what's the need for it? Why would you talk about it at the workplace? Yeah. So in your experience, have you found that, how is it that people bring up some of their, are they reluctant, and what can organizations do to make it safe for people to talk about it?
Um, well, I don't know. Again, it would be. I can't make a sweeping statement to say they're reluctant, because for every yes I give, there will be a no, and for every no I give, there will be a yes, because it's so dependent on individual teams and managers and relationships and circumstances. I have seen instances where people have been very open about what's happening in their lives, and they've found a supportive team environment,
Right.
and they're able to do that. And I've seen the reverse as well, and I've heard of the
Right.
reverse as well. I believe the big difference here that can be made is by the tone at the top. And there
By
also I'm
the,
starting to,
sorry,
by
repeat
the
that,
tone at the top.
tone at the top.
Yeah. So I think if, and I'm starting to see a big difference there as well.
Right.
If our CXO grow, right, your
Hmm.
CEO, the CHRO, the CMO, etc., if they start really being a lot more authentic
Right.
in their conversations, talking about what's happening in their lives
Right.
and relating it to what other people are going through and what they did and
Hmm.
what made a difference for them, and seeing successful people do it.
Yes.
It's weird to say this, but you have to be able to see role
Yes.
model successful people do it, to say it
Absolutely.
is okay to bring your whole self to work and still be successful. And I
That's
see that quite a lot. I mean, I've been very privileged to be part of companies like Accenture and GSK and Walmart, where I've seen our leaders at the top demonstrate this behavior.
that's right.
um, but I am also talking about a small, minuscule part of the industry.
Yeah.
There is a lot more out there. Uh, but I really believe that's where it will make a big difference, and that's where CHROs, I agree, can make a difference, because CHROs are coaching and advising the CXO teams, and if
Yeah.
they can nudge in this direction, they, I think, will open a floodgate of positive behavior down the line.
So, if I were to operationalize this, Sudeep, I would say that, sometimes what could be a practice? Sometimes it helps people to know, here are a set of things that you can do. I would take a leaf out of the current huge trend of storytelling, and saying that storytelling at the workplace is a powerful tool for creating narratives and, creating a culture. So it might be worth your while to introduce the idea of skill building around storytelling,
Yes.
and creating spaces in which you invite successful leaders or role models to share pieces from their personal lives. Sometimes I find that in some organizations, leaders do that over social media. Sometimes they do that in conferences, or sometimes in the evenings, where you might have a little drink and dinner, but a lot of stories are told. Um, while that could be one intervention, what do you think could be some interventions from a policy or a practice standpoint
I
to
think
enable? Yeah.
Sure. I think it's a combination of two or three things that you do, right? So you can't do one without the other. So you have to first um, get the leaders at the top, like I said, to be a lot more authentic,
Right.
and do that very deliberately,
Right.
right? As clinical as it may sound, but very deliberately through the various communication channels, whether you're doing Ask Me Anything sessions or town halls or whatever. But you have to do it very deliberately in a very planned way.
That's right.
So I think that's one part of it. The second part of it is combining it with, like you said, policies and initiatives that help drive that. So, for example, there is no point in, people during pandemic, etc., started creating rules around blanking out times in calendars for lunch because
Right.
people were facing burnout, or no meetings on Friday second half, or things like that, right? People did all sorts of
Yeah.
things. So there's
Yeah.
no point in implementing all of these initiatives with if leaders themselves will keep breaking the rules all the time. But I
That's right.
think if you do the authentic conversation, combine it with leaders being committed to following certain practices, and then combine it with some initiatives and policies that acknowledge. The fourth thing, honestly, Bhavna, is I don't know if I can sit in a room like this in a seat and dictate what will work. I would rather go back to people and
Yeah.
ask them what's going to work for them, because I've seen this so many instances related to benefits, related to rewards, related to policies. My best insights truly come when I'm having a conversation, a focus group with a cross section of people
Well
who
said.
tell me what they actually need, and sometimes the answers are completely different, right, from what you expected. So let's talk to people and figure out, and again ensure that you're talking to people across levels, across locations, across teams, and across gender,
Yeah.
to actually hear and figure out what people need on the ground. Sometimes what they need is not a fancy policy; they just need support, and sometimes the reverse, right?
Yeah.
For example, I mean something as simple um, as daycare. We had daycare, and we had tied up with daycare centers, and then we went a step further because people said it's not enough to have, because the law says you need to have a daycare center close to office, which
Mm,
employees came back and said that doesn't work. It's
that
it's
doesn't
it's not
work.
logical. I would
Mm,
rather have daycare centers close to home.
yeah.
So we extended it and said, let's tie up with daycare centers. And then we moved it to saying, fine, we will tie up with daycare centers for the purposes of complying with the law, but we will give you reimbursement for daycare services that you may take. Then we went a step further, again, based upon what people are coming back and telling us, saying, don't give us money on XYZ other things. They
Mm,
actually told us not to give money there. They said, rather reimburse for the nanny that we need
mm,
at home so that I
mm,
can be more productive while I'm at home and I'm not needing to look after my children the whole day. So we extended the daycare thing to nanny. So I think it's a small example, but I
yeah.
think it's a good example of how you don't always need big ticket branded initiatives to drive some of this culture on the ground. Let's just listen to people and let people tell us what they want, what they truly want, and what will make a difference.
That's a great point, Sudeep. And I think that two things. One, listening to people in terms of because of the fact that there are dynamic or changing needs. And two, listening in a way to be in a compassionate way, in a way to find solutions can also be very important. We've had
Yeah.
multiple instances in which people come back and say, I was asked a set of questions and I didn't know whether I could truly share what I want, or I shared what I want, what I might need, and nothing happened of it. So I think we know about that multiple surveys are conducted or conversations are done and then they are not followed through. So there is an implication of that. So, great point. I think conducting compassionate, generous listening sessions, or doing surveys in a manner that can be followed through for a reasonable outcomes. Whether even if it is to go back and say, what, this is not possible for us right now. For example, I know one organization that came back and said, we cannot afford a creche, a daycare center. So what can we do? and engaging the people, and people came up with a solution to suggest that, okay, we don't want organization to fund it entirely, but how about four of us organizations get together and we can do this. And people can be very, very resourceful that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'd like to stay with the idea of benefits for a while, Sudeep, given your experience in the area as well. So, if you were to imagine what might be valuable benefits in addition to the maternity phase or the young parent phase, as responsibilities are shifting or the demographics are changing, and you were to blue sky imagine what a good benefit would look like, would you? Would you share what you think might be a good benefit from the organization's perspective?
Sure. I mean, off the top of my mind, there are two, three things that come to mind. The one is what may sound like a simple thing, but it's surprising how many organizations don't have it, which is having a thoughtful policy around sabbaticals in place.
Nice.
Uh, it's shocking how many organizations of fairly large sizes or medium-sized organizations don't have it, and
Mm,
not just have a policy tucked away somewhere in the corner, but a policy that's front and center. Right?
mm,
Many organizations do this policy refresh
right.
every few months or every year or so. They
Mm,
never talk about sabbaticals, right? The top three policies are always leave and travel and two, three
China.
others like that, and of course Posh and so on. But talking about that, I think is always a good idea. And if you can create, and there are people I know in organizations who take sabbaticals for the right reasons. And if you can create that as a positive example, saying it's not
Right.
something to be apologetic about, it's
Right.
something that is perfectly okay. So I think that's one thing that organizations can do. The other
Good.
piece is going back to that point about caregiving being a part of overall well being, being a part of overall inclusion. I think if you think carefully about financial well-being. Today,
Mm,
financial well-being and sessions are fairly generic, and they
mm,
are, and not for any wrong reason. It's just that it's a relatively earlier stage of evolution. But if we can make that a little bit more customized to the
mm,
fact of what you said. A lot of people
mm,
don't even realize. Like until you showed me a couple of research and shared with me, I had not realized and thought about that angle about how many of our employees are actually performing the role of caregiver. And do I
mm,
bring that into my financial well-being sessions or even mental well-being sessions? I'm not sure. So I think
mm.
being a little bit conscious of that when you're driving your programs around mental well-being and financial well-being, I think makes will also make a very big difference.
Such wonderful insights there, Sudeep. And I do think that well-being is, such an unexplored area. And there could be so many layers to it, but we do need to go from the most obvious tangible aspects of our well-being, which would be time off, which would be financial well-being, because I think caregivers, because I study caregivers on a daily basis, the two things that caregivers crave for is both time and money, and sometimes they are stretched between the two because you have to continue working, you need to earn, and you have huge expenses. And at the same time, you cannot afford good substitute help, because and that takes away your time as well, or that impacts your productivity at the workplace. There is a category of employees who might be long distance caregivers.
Explain that.
So I live in Bangalore, but my parents live in Warangal, Indore, Meerut. I know they're aging. They might not need active daily living support, but I worry about them and there could be an emergency. Or I worry about them, something has been diagnosed, but I'm torn because my job, I can get a good job. And this is a live case, by the way. I had a conversation with a young woman recently. saying, I have a very good job in Bangalore, but I live in Bilaspur. My mother has Parkinson's, and my father cannot take care of her, and I'm the only child. So, in order to earn a living, I have to be in Bangalore. What do I do?
I think that's where I think I was going back to that point about companies also being a lot more open to gig workers using technology. I think these are the situations where it might help.
Right. So, I'm going to just wind this down now and just say that thank you very much for your time. Sorry, I lost track of time. And would like for you, Sudeep, to give us any closing remarks and we can bring this conversation to a close.
No, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It's been a while since um, I have thought so deeply about this topic, and you have definitely opened up new areas which we can think about. So thank you for provoking that thought, and I hope you continue to do that with all the various companies and people that you're talking to.
Thank you very much for your time, Sudeep. I really enjoyed. You have given us some great insights to work further on.